The hunger gnawed at Delilah's stomach like a wild animal as she stood before the general store counter in Victor, Colorado. Her grandmother's silver locket clutched in her trembling palm, the last beautiful thing she owned in this unforgiving world of 1883. Her father had died 3 months ago in a mining accident. Her mother had succumbed to pneumonia just weeks later. And now, at 21 years old, Delilah Turner found herself utterly alone with nothing but the worn dress on her back and this single piece of jewelry that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in her family. The locket contained a tiny portrait of her grandmother as a young bride, painted on ivory, and Delilah had sworn she would never part with it. But hunger made liars of even the most devoted hearts. "I will give you $3 for it," the shopkeeper said, his voice neither kind nor cruel, just matter of fact as he examined the locket through his spectacles. "It is good silver, but small. $3 and you can take some provisions. $3. It was both everything and nothing." Delilah felt tears burn behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried enough these past months. "That's fine," she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the wooden counter. "I need flour, beans, a little salt pork if you can spare it." The shopkeeper nodded and began gathering items, placing them on the counter with efficient movements. Delilah watched as her last connection to her family disappeared into his cash box, the silver winking once in the afternoon light before vanishing forever. She gathered her meager supplies, wrapping them in the cloth sack she had brought, and turned to leave the store before the tears could betray her. The summer sun was brutal as she stepped onto the dusty street, and she had to pause a moment to let her eyes adjust. Victor was a mining town nestled in the mountains, growing rapidly as more men flooded in hoping to strike gold or silver in the Cripple Creek district. The town bustled with activity wagons rumbling past, men shouting to each other, the distant sound of hammering from new construction. It was a place of opportunity for some, but for Delilah, it had become a place of loss and loneliness. She had no family left, no prospects, and now no heirlooms. The small cabin on the edge of town where she had grown up was all that remained, and even that was mortgaged. She had perhaps 2 months before the bank would take it. 2 months to figure out how to survive in a world that had little use for single women without means. Preston Kane watched the young woman leave the general store from his position outside the saloon across the street, noting the defeated slope of her shoulders and the way she clutched her small bundle of supplies as though it were precious treasure. He had seen her around town before the Turner girl, people called her, though she was hardly a girl anymore. He knew her story, as most people in Victor did. Tragedy seemed to follow some folks like a shadow, and she had certainly had her share. He was 30 years old, a cowboy who had worked cattle drives for the better part of a decade, before deciding to try his hand at horse trading in the mountain towns. He had done well enough to have money in his pocket and no debts to his name, which made him richer than most men in Victor. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that always seemed a bit too long, falling over his forehead in a way that made him push it back frequently. His eyes were a peculiar shade of green, and more than one woman had told him they were his best feature, though he had never paid much attention to such talk. Preston had never been much for settling down. He liked his freedom, liked moving from place to place, answering to no one but himself. But lately, something had shifted in him. Maybe it was turning 30, or maybe it was just seeing too many men die alone on the trail. Whatever the reason, he found himself thinking more about what it might be like to have a home, a wife, a family. Not that he had done anything about it yet. He watched Delilah Turner disappear down the street and felt a tug of sympathy. Then, on impulse, he crossed the dusty road and entered the general store. The shopkeeper looked up as the bell jangled. "Afternoon, Kane. What can I do for you?" "I saw that young woman who just left," Preston said, leaning against the counter with studied casualness. "She sold something to you." The shopkeeper's eyes narrowed slightly, as they did whenever someone asked questions that might interfere with a good deal. "What's it to you?" Preston pulled out a silver dollar and set it on the counter, letting it ring against the wood. "Just curious." She looked upset. The coin disappeared into the shopkeeper's hand with remarkable speed. "The Turner girl sold me a locket, nice piece actually, silver with a painted portrait inside. Gave her $3 for it, which was fair." "I would like to see it," Preston said, and something in his tone made it clear this was not really a request. The shopkeeper hesitated, then shrugged and retrieved the locket from where he had just placed it in his display case. He set it on the counter, and Preston picked it up carefully, examining it in the light from the window. It was indeed a beautiful piece, delicate scrollwork on the silver, a sturdy chain, and when he opened it, a tiny painted portrait of a woman in old-fashioned dress looked back at him with Delilah Turner's same dark eyes. "How much?" Preston asked. "Well, now, it is worth at least $6, the shopkeeper said, his merchant's instinct sensing opportunity. Preston gave him a flat look. "You just paid $3 for it." "That was buying, this is selling. Different proposition entirely." Preston considered arguing, but decided it was not worth the time. He pulled out 6 silver dollars and counted them onto the counter with deliberate slowness. "I will take it." The shopkeeper swept up the coins with satisfaction and passed the locket over. Preston pocketed it carefully and left the store, his mind already working on what he would do next. He could not just walk up to her house and give it back. That would be charity, and he suspected Delilah Turner had too much pride to accept charity from a stranger. No, this would require more thought. As it turned out, fate provided him an opportunity sooner than expected. Delilah spent the rest of that day and the next in her cabin, rationing the food she had bought and trying to come up with a plan for her future. She could sew and she could cook, but the town already had a seamstress and more eating establishments than it needed. She could try to take in laundry, but that barely paid enough to survive on. She had thought about leaving Victor entirely, but where would she go? She had no money for a train ticket, no relatives in other towns, no prospects anywhere else that were better than her prospects here. On the third day, she forced herself to walk into town to see if anyone needed help with anything. She passed the saloon, giving it a wide berth as respectable women did, and made her way to the hotel. The owner, a fussy man named Mr. Garrett, looked her up and down when she asked about work. "I need someone to clean rooms," he admitted. "But I need someone reliable. Can you start tomorrow?" Relief flooded through her so intensely she felt dizzy. "Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Garrett. I will not let you down. 6 days a week, starts at dawn, $1 a day." It was not much, but it was something. Delilah agreed immediately and left the hotel feeling lighter than she had in weeks. $1 a day was $6 a week, which would be enough to buy food and maybe, eventually, save a little toward the mortgage. It would not be easy, but she could survive. She was so lost in her calculations that she did not see the man until she collided with him directly in front of the general store. "Oh," she stumbled backward, and strong hands caught her elbows, steadying her. "I am so sorry. I was not watching where I was going." "No harm done," a deep voice said, and she looked up into remarkable green eyes set in a tanned face. He was tall, this stranger, and dressed like a working cowboy in worn denim and a dusty hat he had tipped back on his head. "Are you all right, miss?" "Yes, I am fine, thank you." She stepped back, suddenly aware that he was still holding her arms. He released her immediately, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I am glad to hear it," he said. "I am Preston Kane. You are Miss Turner, are you not?" Delilah felt herself flush, wondering what he had heard about her. Small towns loved to gossip, especially about those who had fallen on hard times. "I am. How did you know?" "Small town," he said with a shrug. "People talk. I was sorry to hear about your parents." That must have been very difficult. His sympathy seemed genuine, without the pity that so often came with such words, and Delilah found herself relaxing slightly. "Thank you. It has been an adjustment." They stood there for a moment in awkward silence, and then Preston cleared his throat. "I am actually glad I ran into you, Miss Turner. I have a proposition that might interest you." Delilah's guard went up immediately. She had heard enough stories about what men meant when they offered propositions to women alone in the world. "I do not think, nothing improper," Preston said quickly, reading her expression. "I own some horses that I keep in a pasture outside of town, and I am looking for someone to help care for them. Feed them, brush them, keep the water trough filled, that sort of thing. It is about 2 hours of work each day, and I can pay you 50 cents a day for it. 50 cents a day on top of the $1 from the hotel. That would be $9 a week total." Delilah tried not to let her desperation show too clearly. "I do not know much about horses, Mr. Kane. I can teach you what you need to know. Honestly, these are gentle animals. The work is not difficult, just time-consuming, and I am often away dealing with buyers. I need someone I can trust to look after them." He paused. "I heard you just took a job at the hotel, so I thought the timing might work out. You could tend the horses in the afternoon." It was almost too perfect, which made Delilah suspicious. "Why me? Surely there are others who would want the work." Preston met her eyes directly. "Because I think you would do a good job, and because you look like someone who could use a break. If you would rather I ask someone else, I will, but I wanted to offer it to you first." There was something honest in his face, something steady and calm that made Delilah want to trust him. And she desperately needed the work. "I would like to accept," she said carefully. "When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow afternoon. I can meet you here at 2 o'clock and take you out to see the pasture and meet the horses." They agreed on the arrangement, and Preston tipped his hat to her before heading off down the street. Delilah watched him go, feeling a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. $9 a week would not make her rich, but it would let her breathe. It would give her time to figure out her next steps. She did not let herself wonder why a man she barely knew would offer her such work, or whether there might be ulterior motives. She needed the job too much to look at it too closely. The next day, Preston was waiting outside the general store at precisely 2 o'clock, sitting on a beautiful chestnut mare that tossed her head and pranced slightly as Delilah approached. He swung down from the saddle with the easy grace of someone who had spent half his life on horseback. "Afternoon, Miss Turner. Are you ready?" "I am," she said, though she felt nervous butterflies in her stomach. "Have you ridden before?" When she shook her head, he nodded. "That is all right. You can ride with me out to the pasture. It is only about a mile outside of town." He mounted first, then reached down to help pull her up behind him. Delilah settled awkwardly onto the horse's back, very aware that she had to hold onto Preston's waist to keep from sliding off. The warmth of his body through his shirt was strangely comforting, and she tried not to think about how long it had been since she had been this close to another person. The ride out to the pasture was beautiful. The mountains rose up around them in shades of purple and gray, and wildflowers dotted the meadows with splashes of color. Preston pointed out landmarks as they rode, his voice easy and conversational, never pushing her to talk but leaving space for her if she wanted to. Gradually, Delilah found herself relaxing, even letting herself enjoy the ride. The pasture turned out to be a large fenced area beside a creek, with a small barn and a decent-sized shelter for the horses. There were 6 horses in total, and they came trotting over when they saw Preston, clearly expecting treats. He dismounted and helped Delilah down, then pulled some apples from his saddlebag. "Here," he said, handing her one. "Hold your hand flat and let them take it. That way they do not accidentally bite your fingers." Delilah followed his instructions nervously, but the horses were gentle, just as he had promised. Their soft noses tickled her palm as they lipped up the apple pieces, and despite her nerves, she found herself smiling. "This is Thunder," Preston said, indicating a large black gelding. "He is the leader of the little herd. That paint mare is Sunshine and the gray is Storm. The 2 bays are brothers Cash and Carver, and this beauty here is Lady." He stroked the chestnut mare they had ridden in on. "She is my favorite, though do not tell the others." Delilah laughed, surprising herself with the sound. When was the last time she had laughed? Preston spent the next hour showing her everything she needed to do. How to measure out the grain, where the brushes were kept, how to check the water level in the trough and refill it from the creek using a bucket. He was a patient teacher, showing her how to approach the horses safely, how to tell if something was wrong with them, what to do if she ever felt nervous or unsure. "The most important thing is this," he said seriously. "If you ever feel uncomfortable or unsafe for any reason, you do not have to do the work that day. Your safety matters more than the horse's schedule." "Understood." "Understood," Delilah agreed, touched by his concern. "Good. Now, I am usually in town most afternoons, so if you need anything, you can find me at the livery stable or at the boarding house where I am staying, Mrs. Henderson's place on Oak Street. Do not hesitate to ask for help if you need it." They rode back to town as the sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, painting everything in shades of gold. Delilah found herself reluctant for the afternoon to end. Preston had been nothing but kind and respectful, and for the first time in months, she had felt almost normal, just a young woman learning about horses from a patient teacher, not an orphan struggling to survive. When he helped her down from the horse in front of the general store, their eyes met for a moment, and Delilah felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or grief. "Thank you, Mr. Kane," she said softly, "for the job and for your patience today." "Call me Preston," he said with a smile. "And you are welcome, Delilah. I will see you tomorrow," she nodded, and he rode off toward the livery stable, leaving her standing in the street with the strangest feeling blooming in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable rhythm. Delilah rose before dawn to work at the hotel, cleaning rooms and changing linens until early afternoon. Then she would walk out to Preston's pasture and spend a couple of hours with the horses, learning their personalities and quirks, growing more confident in handling them. Preston was often there working on various tasks, mending fence, fixing the barn roof, training one of the younger horses, and they fell into easy conversation as they worked. She learned that he had grown up in Texas, the youngest of 5 brothers, and had left home at 16 to work cattle drives. He told her stories of life on the trail, some funny, some harrowing, all fascinating to someone who had never been more than 20 miles from where she was born. He had a way of talking that made even ordinary things interesting, and more importantly, he asked about her life too, actually listening to her answers. Delilah found herself telling him things she had not talked about in months, memories of her parents, stories from her childhood, her dreams of what she had once hoped her life might become. Preston never offered empty sympathy or useless advice. He just listened, sometimes asking questions, sometimes sharing his own thoughts, but always treating her words as if they mattered. The horses grew to know her, whinnying greetings when she arrived and following her around the pasture like oversized dogs. She developed a special fondness for Sunshine, the paint mare, who had a gentle nature and seemed to sense when Delilah was feeling sad, nuzzling her shoulder as if to comfort her. One afternoon in late July, Preston surprised her by leading out a smaller horse she had not seen before, a pretty sorrel mare with a white blaze. "This is Rosie," he said. "I just bought her yesterday. She is very gentle, and I thought she would be a good horse for you to learn to ride on if you are interested." Delilah stared at him. "Learn to ride? Well, you cannot walk out here forever," Preston said with a grin. "And besides, I think you would enjoy it. What do you say?" What Delilah wanted to say was that no one had done anything this thoughtful for her in longer than she could remember, that she was overwhelmed by his kindness, that she was starting to feel things for him that probably were not wise given their arrangement. Instead, she just said, "I would like that very much." Learning to ride was both terrifying and exhilarating. Preston was endlessly patient, walking beside Rosie at first, then letting Delilah try a slow walk on her own, gradually building up her confidence and skill. She fell off twice, both times landing in soft grass, and both times Preston was there immediately, concern written all over his face as he helped her up and checked that she was not hurt. The second time, she found herself laughing at the absurdity of it. Here she was, covered in grass stains and dirt, being fussed over by a handsome cowboy who looked genuinely worried about her welfare. Preston stared at her for a moment, then started laughing too, and something shifted between them in that moment, some barrier falling away. "You have a beautiful laugh," he said when they had both caught their breath. Then he seemed to realize what he had said and cleared his throat awkwardly. "I mean, what I meant was, thank you," Delilah said softly, feeling her cheeks warm. "I have not had much to laugh about lately." Their eyes met and held, and Delilah felt her heart beating faster. Preston was standing close enough that she could see flecks of gold in his green eyes, close enough that she would only have to sway forward slightly to close the distance between them. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and she realized she wanted him to. But Preston stepped back, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she had come to recognize as his tell when he was nervous or uncertain. "We should get you back on Rosie. The only way to overcome fear is to face it, right?" The moment passed, and they went back to the riding lesson, but something had changed. Delilah could not stop being aware of Preston in a new way, the way his hands felt when he helped adjust her position in the saddle, the sound of his voice when he called out encouragement, the way his whole face lit up when he smiled at her. She was falling for him. There was no point denying it to herself. Preston Kane, with his patient kindness and his steady green eyes and his gentle way with both horses and people, had somehow worked his way past all her defenses and made her feel things she had thought were lost forever in the grief of the past few months. The question was whether he felt the same way, or if he just saw her as an employee, someone to be helped because he was a decent man with a charitable heart. Preston, for his part, was dealing with his own realizations. He had offered Delilah the job partly out of genuine need. The horses did require regular care, but mostly because he had wanted a reason to spend time with her, to get to know her better. What he had not anticipated was how quickly and thoroughly he would fall for her. Everything about Delilah drew him in. Her quiet strength in the face of hardship, her gentleness with the horses, the way her whole face transformed when she smiled. The rare sound of her laugh was like music, and Preston found himself doing ridiculous things just to try to make her laugh again. He loved watching her grow more confident, both with the horses and with herself, loved the way she had started to relax around him, to trust him. But Preston knew his own limitations. He was a cowboy with no real home, a drifter by nature who happened to be staying in one place for a while. What did he have to offer someone like Delilah? She deserved stability, security, a real home. She deserved someone better than a man who had spent most of his adult life sleeping under the stars and moving from town to town. And yet, he could not help imagining what it might be like. A house, maybe on some land outside of town. Delilah waiting for him when he came home from work. Children eventually with her dark eyes and beautiful smile. A real life, a real family, the kind he had never let himself want before. He was in love with her. That truth had become undeniable over the past few weeks. The question was what to do about it. The answer came to him one evening in early August when he stopped by the general store for supplies. The shopkeeper was rearranging his display case, and Preston's eye caught on something familiar, a silver locket with delicate scrollwork. Delilah's locket, the one he had bought weeks ago and carried in his pocket ever since, trying to figure out the right way to return it to her. Looking at it now, Preston suddenly knew exactly what he wanted to do. It was crazy, probably too fast, definitely risky. But sometimes the heart knew things the head took too long to figure out, and Preston's heart had been telling him for weeks now that Delilah Turner was the woman he wanted to spend his life with. The next afternoon, he waited until after Delilah had finished with the horses. She was brushing down Rosie, humming softly to herself, looking more content than he had ever seen her. The late summer sun caught in her dark hair, and Preston felt his chest tighten with the force of his feelings. "Delilah," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" She turned, a smile on her lips that faded slightly when she saw his serious expression. "Of course. Is something wrong?" "No, nothing is wrong. Preston took off his hat and turned it in his hands, a nervous gesture. "I have something I need to tell you and something I need to ask you, and I am probably going to make a mess of both. But I am going to try anyway." Delilah set down the brush and gave him her full attention, her dark eyes curious and slightly worried. Preston took a deep breath. "A few weeks ago, when you sold your locket to the general store, I bought it back from the shopkeeper. I have been carrying it around ever since, trying to figure out how to return it to you without making you feel like I was offering charity." He pulled the locket from his pocket and held it out to her. Delilah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Why would you do that?" "Because I saw you leave that store looking like you had lost something precious, and I wanted to give it back to you. Because even then, before I really knew you, I wanted to do something to help you, to make things a little bit easier." He paused, then continued, his words coming faster now. "But it is more than that now. These past weeks, getting to know you, spending time with you, Delilah, you have become the best part of my days. You have become important to me in ways I did not know were possible." Tears were streaming down Delilah's face now, but she did not look away from him. "I know this is probably too fast," Preston continued. "I know I am just a cowboy with no real prospects beyond some horses and whatever jobs I can find. I know you could probably do better, find someone with more to offer. But I love you, Delilah Turner. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you make everything seem more right just by being there. And I am hoping, maybe, that you might feel something for me too." "I do," Delilah whispered. "Preston, I do. I love you too." The relief that flooded through Preston at those words was so intense it made him dizzy. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, cupping her face in his hands and kissing her with all the pent-up emotion of the past weeks. Delilah kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "Then marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, and I know we have only known each other a short time, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Marry me, Delilah. Let me spend the rest of my life making you happy, giving you the security and the home you deserve. Let me love you the way you deserve to be loved." "Yes," Delilah said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Preston, I will marry you." Preston kissed her again, then carefully fastened the locket around her neck where it belonged. Delilah touched it with trembling fingers, looking up at him with such love in her eyes that it took his breath away. "I cannot believe you bought it back for me," she said softly. "I cannot believe you have been carrying it all this time." "I would do anything for you," Preston said simply. "I know that now. You are everything I did not know I was looking for." They stood there in the pasture as the sun set around them, holding each other, making plans and promises in whispered voices. The horses grazed nearby, unconcerned with the human drama playing out in their midst, and somewhere in the mountains, a bird sang an evening song. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church in Victor, with most of the town in attendance. Delilah wore a simple white dress that Preston had insisted on buying for her their first real argument, as she had protested the expense, but he had been adamant that she deserved a new dress for their wedding day. Mrs. Henderson, Preston's landlady, had helped her get ready, fussing over her hair and dabbing tears from her eyes as she proclaimed that she had never seen a lovelier bride. Preston wore his best clothes and looked so handsome waiting for her at the altar that Delilah felt her breath catch. His eyes never left hers as she walked down the aisle, and when she reached him and took his hand, she felt like she was finally home after a long, difficult journey. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They spoke their vows in strong, clear voices, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever life might bring. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation sighed audibly. The reception was held at the hotel where Delilah had worked, and Mr. Garrett had insisted on providing the cake as a wedding present. People congratulated them, wished them well, and there was music and dancing and more happiness than Delilah had thought possible just a few months ago. Late in the evening, as they prepared to leave for the small house Preston had rented on the edge of town, their first real home together, Delilah overheard 2 older women talking. "Such a romantic story," one of them said. "The way he bought back her locket and proposed with it. Like something from a novel." "She is lucky," the other agreed. "Preston Kane is a good man. She will have a good life with him." Delilah smiled to herself. She was lucky, but not in the way they meant. She was lucky because she had found someone who saw her, really saw her, and loved her not despite her hardships but with full knowledge of them. She was lucky because Preston had offered her not just security but partnership, not just a home but a life built together. That first night in their little house, they lay together in the darkness, talking in quiet voices about their future. Preston told her about his dreams of expanding his horse business, maybe buying some land, building a real ranch. Delilah shared her hopes of having a garden, maybe some chickens, creating a home that felt stable and permanent in a way nothing in her life had felt for a long time. "We will build it together," Preston said, pulling her close against his side. "Whatever we create, we will create it together. You are not alone anymore, Delilah. You will never be alone again." She fell asleep that night feeling safer and more loved than she could remember feeling since childhood, Preston's arms around her and his steady heartbeat beneath her ear. The first months of marriage were an adjustment, as they always are. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, had their first disagreements and first reconciliations. Preston learned that Delilah liked to wake slowly in the mornings with coffee and quiet, while she discovered that he was at his best in the early hours, and would bounce out of bed ready to start the day. She learned that he snored when he was especially tired, and he learned that she had nightmares sometimes about losing her parents, waking in panic until he held her and reminded her she was safe. But through it all, the foundation of love and respect they had built held firm. They worked side by side on Preston's horse business, which began to grow as word spread about his skill with training. Delilah proved to have a natural talent for the business side of things, keeping the books and negotiating with buyers in a way that impressed Preston deeply. By their first Christmas together, they had saved enough money to pay off the mortgage on Delilah's childhood cabin, which they immediately sold to fund the purchase of 20 acres just outside of Victor. It was beautiful land, with a creek running through it and views of the mountains, and they began making plans to build a house there in the spring. "Not too big," Delilah said as they stood on the land one cold December afternoon, their breath forming clouds in the air. "But big enough for a family eventually." Preston pulled her close, his eyes sparkling with hope and love. "A family, I like the sound of that." "Me too," Delilah said, touching the locket at her throat. She wore it every day now, a reminder of how far they had come. "Me too." Winter passed slowly, with deep snows that sometimes kept them housebound for days at a time. They used those days to refine their plans for the house, to dream about the future, to strengthen the bonds between them. Preston taught Delilah to play cards, and she taught him to make her mother's recipes. They read to each other in the evenings by lamplight and made love in their warm bed while winter storms raged outside. When spring finally came, they broke ground on the house. Preston did much of the work himself, with help from some men he hired from town, and Delilah worked alongside them when she could, her hands growing calloused and strong. The house rose slowly from the ground, taking shape exactly as they had envisioned it, a sturdy structure with 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a wide porch that would be perfect for sitting on summer evenings. They moved into the house in July of 1884, exactly 1 year after Preston had first approached Delilah about caring for his horses. Delilah stood in the empty parlor and cried happy tears as she looked around at the home they had built together, literally built, with their own hands and sweat and determination. "Welcome home, Mrs. Kane," Preston said softly, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Welcome home," she echoed, leaning back against him. That same month, Delilah realized she was pregnant. The realization came gradually, a missed cycle, morning nausea, and unusual fatigue. She waited until she was certain before telling Preston, wanting to be sure before raising his hopes. When she finally told him one evening after dinner, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His eyes widened with shock, then flooded with tears, and then he was lifting her up and spinning her around, laughing and crying at the same time. "We are having a baby," he kept saying, as if he could not quite believe it. "Delilah, we are having a baby." "We are," she confirmed, her own tears flowing freely. "In the early spring, I think, maybe March or April." Preston set her down carefully, as if she were suddenly made of glass. "Are you all right? Do you need to sit down? Should we get the doctor?" Delilah laughed at his sudden, anxious concern. "I am fine, Preston. Women have babies all the time, but yes, we should probably see the doctor soon just to make sure everything is progressing well." The pregnancy progressed normally, though the winter months were difficult. Delilah's stomach grew round and large, and she found it increasingly hard to move comfortably or sleep through the night. Preston was endlessly patient and attentive, bringing her tea when she felt nauseous, rubbing her aching back, talking to her belly in the evenings, and telling their unborn child stories about the horses and the ranch. On a cold March morning in 1885, Delilah went into labor. The doctor was summoned, along with Mrs. Henderson and two other experienced women from town. Preston was banished from the bedroom but refused to leave the house, pacing the kitchen and parlor like a caged animal as he listened to the sounds coming from upstairs. It was a long labor, lasting through the day and into the evening. Preston aged what felt like years in those hours, terrified every time he heard Delilah cry out in pain. But finally, just as the sun was setting, he heard a new sound, the thin, angry wail of a newborn baby. Mrs. Henderson came downstairs a few minutes later, her face exhausted but smiling. "Congratulations, Preston. You have a son. Both mother and baby are doing well." Preston took the stairs two at a time, bursting into the bedroom to find Delilah propped up against pillows, looking exhausted but radiant with a tiny bundle in her arms. She looked up as he entered, her smile lighting up her whole face. "Preston, come meet your son." He approached almost reverently, looking down at the tiny red-faced infant in Delilah's arms. The baby was perfect: 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, a shock of dark hair, and eyes that seemed to look right at Preston with uncanny awareness. "He is perfect," Preston whispered, reaching out to touch one small hand. The baby's fingers curled around his, gripping with surprising strength. "He is absolutely perfect, just like his mother." "What should we name him?" Delilah asked softly. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son, Preston suddenly knew. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel James Kane, after your father and mine." Fresh tears spilled down Delilah's cheeks. "That is perfect. Hello, Daniel. Welcome to the world, little one." The early weeks with a newborn were exhausting and overwhelming, but also filled with a joy that neither Preston nor Delilah had anticipated. They took turns walking with Daniel when he cried at night, marveling over every small change as he grew. Preston proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle with the baby, singing off key lullabies and making silly faces to get Daniel to smile. Delilah would often find them together, Preston sitting in the rocking chair with Daniel asleep on his chest, both of them peaceful and content. In those moments, she would feel such overwhelming love for her little family that it almost hurt. As Daniel grew from infant to baby to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. Preston's reputation as a horse trainer grew, and they found themselves with more business than they could handle. They hired 2 young men from town to help with the daily work, which freed up Preston to focus on the training while Delilah managed the business side. When Daniel was 2 years old, Delilah discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Ann, was born in the autumn of 1887. She had her father's green eyes and her mother's dark hair, and from the start, she was a calm, observant baby who seemed to take everything in with quiet interest. Daniel was fascinated by his little sister, wanting to help with everything. Preston and Delilah had to watch him carefully to make sure he was not too enthusiastic in his helpfulness, but it was clear that he loved Sarah dearly. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and Preston and Delilah's love only deepened with time. They had their challenges. Of course, there were lean years when the market for horses was slow, illnesses that frightened them, the everyday struggles of raising children and running a business. But they faced everything together, their partnership and love the foundation on which everything else was built. When Daniel was 8 and Sarah was 6, Delilah discovered she was pregnant once more. This pregnancy was unexpected, and at first, she worried she was 33 now, older than she had been with the other 2. But the pregnancy progressed well, and in the spring of 1893 they welcomed twin boys into the family, Matthew and Michael, identical in appearance but different in temperament from the start. Their house, which had once seemed so spacious, was now always full of noise and activity. Preston had to add on 2 more bedrooms, and Delilah sometimes wondered how she had ever thought 3 bedrooms would be enough. But she would not have traded the chaos for anything. This was the life she had dreamed of during those dark months after her parents' death: a full house, a loving husband, children who were healthy and happy. The children grew up on the ranch, learning to ride almost before they could walk, helping with the horses and developing their own relationships with the animals. Daniel proved to have his father's gift for training, while Sarah preferred the business side, often helping her mother with the books even as a young girl. The twins were still young, but they showed signs of being natural horsemen, fearless and confident in the saddle. On a warm summer evening in 1898, Preston and Delilah sat on their porch watching the sunset, as they had done countless times over the years. The children were all in bed, finally, after the usual chaos of baths and stories and negotiations, for just one more glass of water. The ranch was quiet except for the sounds of horses moving in the pasture and the creek babbling in the distance. Delilah rested her head on Preston's shoulder, her hand in his. She was 46 years old now, with silver starting to thread through her dark hair and lines around her eyes from years of squinting into the sun. Preston was 54, his dark hair more gray than not, his face weathered by years of outdoor work. But to Delilah, he was still the handsome cowboy who had bought back her locket and proposed marriage, still the man who made her feel loved and cherished every single day. "You remember when we first met?" she asked softly. "I was so desperate, so scared. I had sold the last thing I owned that had any value, and I was standing in that street wondering how I was going to survive." "I remember," Preston said, squeezing her hand. "I remember thinking you were the saddest, most beautiful woman I had ever seen, and I remember wanting to do something, anything, to help you." "You did more than help me," Delilah said. "You gave me a life, Preston. You gave me love and a home and a family. You gave me everything I thought I had lost forever." "We gave each other everything," Preston corrected gently. "I was drifting before I met you, Delilah. I had no real purpose, no real home. You gave me a reason to stay in one place, to build something permanent. You gave me a family and a future. We saved each other." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple. Delilah touched the locket at her throat, as she still did sometimes, remembering the girl she had been when she sold it and the woman she had become since. "I love you," she said, the words as true now as they had been that day in the pasture 15 years ago. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Preston replied, turning to kiss her gently. "Always and forever, my Delilah." The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows. They lost Preston's oldest brother to illness, attended weddings of friends, and helped their neighbors through hard times as others had once helped them. The town of Victor continued to grow and change around them, evolving from a rough mining town into a more established community. Daniel met a girl named Emma when he was 20, and they were married a year later in a ceremony that reminded Preston and Delilah of their own wedding years before. Sarah proved to have no interest in marriage, much preferring to focus on expanding the ranch's business operations. She had a sharp mind for numbers and negotiations, and under her guidance, the ranch became one of the most successful in the region. The twins, Matthew and Michael, eventually went into partnership together, starting a ranch of their own on land adjacent to their parents' property. They remained close to the family, often joining them for Sunday dinners that grew larger and louder as grandchildren began to arrive. Preston and Delilah became grandparents for the first time in 1904, when Daniel and Emma welcomed a daughter they named Delilah Rose, after her grandmother. Holding that tiny baby in her arms, Delilah cried tears of joy, overwhelmed by the continuation of the family she and Preston had built together. More grandchildren followed over the years. Daniel and Emma had 5 children in total, while Matthew married a sweet woman named Lucy and had 3 children, and Michael wed a rancher's daughter named Catherine and had 4. Even Sarah eventually married, late in life at 35, to a banker from Denver who understood her independent nature and loved her for it. They had 1 daughter, a brilliant girl they named Margaret. As Preston and Delilah grew older, they gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the ranch, turning over more and more responsibility to their children. But they never stopped working entirely. Preston could still be found most mornings in the pasture with the horses, moving more slowly than he once did, but with the same gentle skill. Delilah still kept an eye on the business ledgers and offered advice when asked. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1914, their children and grandchildren threw them a party that seemed to include half the town of Victor. There were speeches and toasts, stories told and retold about the early days of the ranch. But the best part for both Preston and Delilah was simply looking around at the sea of faces: children, grandchildren, friends, neighbors, and seeing the impact of the life they had built together. 30 years, Delilah marveled later that night when they were finally alone again. Has it really been 30 years? Best 30 years of my life, Preston said firmly. He pulled her close, and they danced slowly in their parlor to music only they could hear, moving together with the ease of long practice. Mine too, Delilah agreed. Every single day with you has been a gift, Preston Kane. The years continued to march forward, as they always do. They faced health challenges as they aged. Preston developed arthritis that made mounting a horse difficult, and Delilah's eyesight began to fail, making it hard for her to do the detailed bookwork she had once loved. But they adapted, supporting each other through each challenge, just as they always had. They celebrated their 40th anniversary in 1924, surrounded by an even larger gathering of family. They now had 17 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren, with more on the way. The ranch had expanded far beyond what they had originally imagined, now encompassing over 300 acres and employing a dozen workers. But for Preston and Delilah, the measure of their success was never about acres or money. It was about the love they shared, the family they had created, the life they had built from almost nothing. One evening in the spring of 1928, as they sat on their porch watching yet another sunset, Delilah suddenly said, "Do you still have it?" Preston did not need to ask what she meant. "Of course," he said, reaching into his pocket. Even after all these years, he still carried it, the locket that had started everything, now worn smooth from decades of handling. He passed it to Delilah, and she opened it carefully, looking at the tiny portrait of her grandmother inside. "I wonder what she would think," Delilah mused, "if she knew that this locket, her locket, would be the beginning of all this." "I think she would be proud," Preston said. "I think she would look at you, at our family, at everything we have built, and she would be so proud." Delilah closed the locket and held it to her heart. "When I am gone," she said softly, "I want Sarah to have this. She is so much like me, so practical and focused on business. I want her to have this reminder that sometimes the most practical thing you can do is open your heart to love." "You are not going anywhere for a long time yet," Preston said firmly, though they both knew it was not entirely true. They were both in their 70s now, and while they were still active and healthy for their age, they knew their time was growing shorter. "Neither are you," Delilah replied with equal firmness. "We made a deal, remember, together until the end and then beyond." "Together until the end and beyond," Preston agreed, taking her hand. They sat together as the sun set over the mountains they had called home for nearly 45 years, content in each other's presence, grateful for every moment they had been given. Preston lived to be 81 years old, passing away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1931. He had spent the previous day as he spent most of his days working with the horses, playing with his great-grandchildren, and sitting with Delilah as the sun set. He told her he loved her before they went to bed that night, as he did every night, and kissed her with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding day. When Delilah woke the next morning to find him gone, her first emotion was not grief but gratitude. Gratitude that he had not suffered, that he had lived a full life surrounded by love, that she had been blessed with nearly 5 decades by his side. At the funeral, attended by what seemed like the entire town and filled with his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, the preacher spoke of Preston's kindness, his integrity, his skill with horses, and his love for his family. But Delilah knew that the real measure of Preston's life was not in any words that could be spoken. It was in the faces of everyone gathered there, all the lives he had touched, all the love he had created, all the good he had done simply by being who he was. After the service, Sarah came and stood beside her mother, taking her hand. "He loved you so much, Mama," she said softly. "Everyone knew it. The way he looked at you, it never changed, not in all the years. He loved you the same at the end as he did in the beginning." "I know," Delilah said, tears streaming down her face. "And I loved him the same way. I will love him the same way for whatever time I have left." Delilah lived for 3 more years after Preston's death. She spent that time surrounded by family, telling stories of the early days to grandchildren and great-grandchildren who listened with rapt attention. She talked about the hunger that had driven her to sell her grandmother's locket, about the handsome cowboy who had bought it back and changed her life, about the ranch they had built together from nothing but love and determination. On warm evenings, she would sit on the porch they had shared for so many years, touching the locket at her throat and talking to Preston as if he were still there beside her. And in a way, she felt his presence in the whisper of wind through the grass, in the sound of horses moving in the pasture, in every sunset over the mountains they had loved. Sarah stayed close during those years, managing the ranch and making sure her mother had everything she needed. True to Delilah's wishes, she wore the locket after her mother passed it to her one day, understanding the weight of history and love it carried. Delilah passed away peacefully in her sleep in the early spring of 1934, just as the wildflowers were beginning to bloom on the mountainsides. She was 72 years old, and she had lived to see 23 grandchildren and 14 great-grandchildren. Her funeral was as well attended as Preston's had been, a testament to the life she had lived and the love she had shared. They buried her beside Preston on a hillside overlooking the ranch, under a sky so blue it seemed impossible. As the family gathered for the burial, Daniel stood with his arm around his eldest daughter, Delilah Rose, who was now a woman of 30 with children of her own. "Grandmother told me once," Delilah Rose said softly, "that she and grandfather saved each other, that they were both lost until they found one another, and that their love gave them both a purpose and a future." "That is true," Daniel agreed. "They did save each other. And in doing so, they created all of this, our family, the ranch, the legacy they left behind. Everything we are, everything we have, started with their love." Sarah, standing nearby with her husband and daughter, touched the locket at her throat. She also told me that the most important things in life cannot be measured in dollars or acres. They can only be measured in love given and received, in lives touched, in the difference you make in the world through kindness and compassion. They made a tremendous difference, Michael added, his arm around his wife Catherine. Not just to us, their family, but to everyone who knew them. They showed us how to love, how to work hard, how to build something lasting. As they said their final goodbyes, the family took comfort in knowing that Preston and Delilah were together again, just as they had promised each other they would be. Together until the end and beyond, they had kept that promise, their love transcending even death. In the years that followed, the ranch continued to thrive under the management of the next generation, and the generation after that. The story of how it all began with a desperate woman selling her last heirloom, and a kind cowboy buying it back, became family legend, told and retold at gatherings, passed down through the generations as a reminder of where they came from, and the power of love to transform lives. The locket itself remained in the family, passed from Sarah to her daughter Margaret, and from Margaret to her own daughter, each woman adding her own story to the legacy it carried. And always, when hard times came or when someone needed reminding of what truly mattered, they would open that locket and look at the portrait inside, remembering the woman who had once owned it and the love story it had sparked. Victor, Colorado, continued to grow and change over the decades, but the Kane Ranch remained a constant, a landmark and a legacy. People in town still told stories about Preston and Delilah, how he had loved her from almost the first moment he saw her, how she had transformed from a desperate orphan into a strong, successful woman, how together they had built not just a ranch but a dynasty of love and family that continued to flourish long after they were gone. On the hillside where they were buried, wildflowers bloomed every spring, and their descendants would often come to sit there, bringing flowers and bringing their children to pay their respects. The headstone was simple, bearing both their names and a single line that Sarah had chosen, together until the end and beyond. And though decades and then a century passed, though the world around their ranch changed in ways they never could have imagined, the love story of Preston Kane and Delilah Turner remained alive, a testament to the power of kindness, the miracle of second chances, and the enduring strength of true love. It was a story that proved that sometimes, in our darkest moments, when we have nothing left but desperation, fate sends us exactly what we need. For Delilah, it had been a cowboy with kind eyes and a generous heart. For Preston, it had been a woman who taught him what it meant to have a home and a purpose beyond himself. Their love had started with a locket sold in desperation and bought back in compassion, had grown through shared work and mutual respect, had deepened into a partnership that built not just a ranch but a legacy. And in the end, it had proven to be exactly what both of them had needed: a love that saved them, sustained them, and created something beautiful that lasted long beyond their own lives. The last time Sarah told the story of her parents to her great-granddaughter, she was 92 years old, sitting on the porch of the ranch house that was now over 100 years old, but still stood strong and sturdy. The little girl, just 8 years old, listened with wide eyes as Sarah described how her grandmother had sold the very locket that now hung around Sarah's neck, and how her grandfather had bought it back and used it to propose. Did they live happily ever after? The little girl asked when the story was done. Sarah smiled, touching the locket gently. They did, sweetheart. They really did. They had hard times and challenges, as everyone does, but they faced them together with love and respect and kindness. They built a life and a family that continues to this day. You are part of their happily ever after, you know. All of us are. I hope I find a love like that someday, the little girl said wistfully. If you are very lucky and very wise, you will, Sarah replied. The key is to remember what really matters, not money or status or possessions, but love and kindness and building something meaningful with someone who values you for who you are. That is what my parents had. That is what made their story so special. As the sun set over the mountains that evening, casting everything in shades of gold and rose, Sarah sat holding her great-granddaughter's hand, feeling the weight of the locket against her chest and the warmth of family surrounding her. The story of Preston and Delilah Kane had become legend, but to Sarah, they would always simply be Mama and Papa, two people who had loved each other deeply, who had built something beautiful from almost nothing, and who had shown everyone around them what was possible when two hearts joined together in true partnership. Their story had no tragic ending, no dramatic finale. It simply was what it had always been, a love story, pure and simple, that began with a hungry woman trading her last heirloom for food and a kind cowboy who bought it back and offered her not just the locket but his heart, his name, and his future. And from that moment of compassion and connection, everything else had flowed: the ranch, the family, the legacy that continued to grow and flourish more than a century after that first meeting on a dusty street in Victor, Colorado. It was, in the end, exactly what every love story should be: a tale of two people who found each other when they needed each other most, who chose love over fear, who built something lasting through hard work and dedication, and who proved that sometimes the greatest treasures in life are not the things we inherit or acquire, but the love we give and receive along the way.